Charles Manson was determined to make something of a life that had started badly, but only got worse. Manson was a masterful manipulator who cast a spell over those who were closest to him. He was also something of a songwriter who believed he could achieve fame as a musician. But Charles Manson would not be most remembered for the songs he wrote, nor the tunes he sung. This is a killer soundtrack. Crimes that shocked the world.
If you ask someone to define the word evil, oftentimes they'll come up with Charles Manson as an example of it. Charles Manson is iconic. If there was a Mount Rushmore of criminals, Charles Manson would be on it.
The night of August 8th of 1969, after that, you were no longer safe in your own bed. Abigail Folger was literally reading a book in bed, and within 30 minutes became one of the most famous murder victims in American history. Comfort level, out the door.
I always thought it was kind of cool to write about things that not everybody really wanted to write about. But it's just one of those things that you just can't believe, so that's maybe what's intrigues you to want to find out more information about these guys that have done these horrible crimes.
Charles Manson came to LA in large part because he wanted to fashion a career in the music business. Everybody there is from somewhere else, and they're all trying to make connections to make something happen.
We do tend to be, as a race, absolutely fascinated by people who go a little bit too far. I think Manson played the best trick in the world on society in that he hitched his wagon to the biggest band on planet Earth.
Charles Manson was no ordinary child. Neither was he content with an ordinary life. Born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1934, to his 16-year-old Kathleen Maddox, Manson took the surname of a man his mother later married. But he was raised by foster parents and in a series of institutions as he quickly fell into a life of crime. At just 13, he was convicted of armed robbery, and at 17, of rape. By the time he turned 32, Charles Manson had spent more than half of his life locked away in criminal institutions. But much worse was to follow. In 1967, following his latest parole, Manson moved to San Francisco, initially intent on making a name for himself as a musician, having taught himself how to play guitar during his stays in prison. During the Summer of Love, he drew followers, mainly young middle-class American women, who seemed to be captivated by an eccentric and charismatic older man. In 1969, when the so-called Manson family moved to Spahn Ranch, northwest of Los Angeles, their leader's spell-like control would trigger a series of horrifying crimes.
Charles Manson was a cult leader. He masterminded this murder spree, but he had his devotees, his family, do the murders for him. So what he was actually convicted of was murder by proxy, other individuals committing murder at his behest and on his behalf.
Charles Manson's bizarre magnetism, his ability to captivate an audience with twisted tales of hate, sex, and violence, which he often regaled while strumming his acoustic guitar, entranced dozens of followers on his way from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Like a macabre Pied Piper, Manson led his cult to kill.
He was an extremely dangerous, sociopathic, narcissistic individual. He was not well educated, but he was very intelligent, I believe. Combine sociopathic tendencies with a fairly high intelligence, and you have a very dangerous individual. It happened in the backdrop of Hollywood, the Hollywood Hills. It was sensational. The murders themselves were so brutal and so seemingly senseless that it took the public consciousness by storm, almost like an atomic bomb. And it became just a phenomenon of epic proportions in terms of the popular culture.
Caton DePenna is a founding member and vocalist in the thrash metal band Hyrax. Although the band was formed 15 years after Charles Manson's final incarceration, the killer's grip on popular culture had hardly loosened. So when Caton DePenna and Hyrax were contemplating subject matter for a new album, they decided to tell Manson's story.
First album back in 1985, a record called Raging Violence. There's a song on there called Bloodbath. Obviously, growing up in Southern California, we heard about Charlie Manson, so that was like you shouldn't try to act like it doesn't exist because it does exist. It kind of goes good with our whole thing, you know, like we wear black, you know, we like things heavy, those subjects are heavy. It's heavy in the real sense of the word heavy. We're talking about subjects that a lot of bands, you don't see that many bands really sing about the stuff we sing about. It's a real music, it's for real people. That's what I love about it. Like, you go to concerts and heavy metal fans, they get along even if they don't speak the same language because they have something in common. They like the same bands. If they like Black Sabbath or they like Kiss or whoever, they're huge fans, and that's what brings them all together. It's amazing to see. That's the beauty of heavy metal, is that it brings all these people together that probably normally wouldn't get along, you know? It's a beautiful thing. You'd be amazed how many people get calmed down by heavy metal. I know it's all loud and explosive and makes buildings shake, but it really does calm down the most wildest humans I've met. You know, I've met people that without heavy metal, they probably would be locked up.
Those who signed up to Manson's mantra perhaps did so without serious contemplation of the perils of their conscription. The most devoted of family members would do anything for their leader. In the summer of 1969, Charles Manson put his own powers of persuasion to the test when he instructed a killing spree in a wealthy LA neighborhood, a spree he hoped would trigger Helter Skelter, the title of a Beatles song that Manson used to describe an impending racial war. He had several willing participants. On the night of August 8 and in the early hours of August 9, 1969, Manson left Linda Kasabian, Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel at a house on Cielo Drive, Benedict Canyon, with particular instructions. The house, once home to record producer Terry Melcher, was occupied by actress Sharon Tate, the wife of movie director Roman Polanski. Also at the Cielo Drive home were Abigail Fulcher, her boyfriend Wojciech Frykowski, and Hollywood hairdresser Jay Sebring. After killing Stephen Parent, who had been visiting a friend at a local house on the estate, the four Manson family members slaughtered the residents of the Cielo Drive address. They shot, stabbed, and beat to death Folger, Frykowski, Sebring, and Tate, who was almost 9 months pregnant at the time. The word pig was scrawled in blood on the front door of the house. The next night, with Manson again at the helm, his followers, who on this occasion included Leslie Van Houten, continued their rage. This time, Manson directly assisted by tying up Lino LaBianca and his wife, Rosemary, before leaving the premises on Waverly Drive. He left the LaBiancas to be stabbed to death by his crazed followers. The words, "Death to Pigs" and "Helter Skelter" were scrawled in blood at the scene.
This was not about the killing itself. It was about the statement that they were making, and what Manson was attempting to do was incite what he referred to as Helter Skelter, which he had borrowed from the Beatles song of the same name. But what it meant to Manson was he was trying to incite a race war, and he was attempting to frame the Black Panthers as responsible for these murders, thinking that white America would rise up and it would ignite a race war, which of course did not happen. He was grandiose. believed that he in fact was the chosen one who was going to lead the white race after Helter Skelter and after the race war, that he and his family would be the ones who would remain and would come out of the abyss and repopulate the world. The impact that Charles Manson and the Manson family murders had on the popular culture, I think, happened at a time that it created a perfect storm in America. If the same murders had happened in a different era, I don't know if they would have had the same impact. But you had a time in the late 1960s where America was losing its innocence. It was set against this era of peace and love, simultaneously contrasted with war, the Vietnam War. Young people were questioning their parents' values, and so there was turmoil. And along comes these brutal murders that were committed in the Hollywood Hills, the iconic Hollywood Hills, and it was murdering the beautiful, rich people of America. Nothing like this had ever happened before. And because it happened at a time of this sort of social and political unrest, I think it just incrementally contributed to the explosive nature of it and the impact on the American consciousness.
It also raised the question, why would anyone commit such horrific crimes on apparently innocent victims? The despicable acts of the Manson family would resonate for years after their startling appearance in the summer of '69. Charles Manson in particular would continue to be the subject of cultural references in song, film, and literature. Scott Michaels has a clear recollection of when Manson crept under his skin for the first time.
1976 is when I was first exposed to Manson, and that was when the film Helter Skelter came out. I was just a little boy growing up in Detroit when that movie came out, and it was so scary that I was afraid that Manson was going to come crawling up the side of my house and then crawling in my windows and kill me. It struck a chord with me because it had to do with rock stars and movie stars, and there was such a show business feel to it. It changed everything. It changed everyone's comfort level. And here I was, this little bright-eyed boy, and all of a sudden this sort of sinister creature was out there. It was really scary.
The brutality of the murders were in contrast with the literal image of the Manson family, whose leader was hardly imposing and whose devotees were innocent-looking young girls.
Wojciech Rakowski passed out on the sofa, bam, dead on the front lawn in a half an hour. So yeah, it changed everybody's comfort level. And then adding on to that, these cute little cherub kids that are, they're smiling and going, and you're gonna be next. Hippies couldn't even trust each other after that.
The initial fear Scott Michaels felt towards the deranged Manson family would turn into a fascination for the gruesome detail of the event, and more widely an interest in humanity's capacity to commit such appalling crimes. It also sparked his own entrepreneurial spirit, which eventually resulted in the founding of a Los Angeles tour company that focuses on Hollywood's dark side.
The museum is something I've worked on since I was a kid, and not in a contrived way. I just would, when I'd pass things, I would take pieces of them. I lived in a corner where I grew up in Detroit, and there were car accidents on our corner, and once or twice a year, someone would get killed on my corner. And my mom used to make mosaics out of the car accident glass. That sort of prompted it, I don't know. There was a book Stephen King wrote, Stand By Me, and that sort of encapsulated for that period of my life, where these kids just went out to find a dead body. And I've never been afraid to look, and I've always pursued it. And I've been desensitized to it, too, by growing up where I grew up.
One bizarre item became 2, then 3, and eventually, he had enough items to display them in his museum.
It's probably the most important piece is that large piece of Sharon Tate's fireplace from the home. When they destroyed the home in 1993, I went up to the house and I asked one of the workmen for a piece of it. That's as close as history as it's going to be. I mean, these awful events, they echoed off of those stones. And that goes for almost everything in here. Somebody sent me some of his hair, Manson's hair. It's an odd collection of things. These are documents having to do from the killers. That Christmas card is from Susan Atkins. It's signed Love Susan on the inside. There's the letter I got from Tex Watson. Again, it's a different time. I don't know if I'd do it today, but they are things that I did at one point in time.
Before Manson unrolled his despicable plot to find his way into society's spotlight, he had first sought fame and fortune through the music industry.
Manson's connection to the music industry is actually quite fascinating. I've heard Neil Young say that he had met Manson when Manson first came upon the music scene in California, and he thought he had some talent. And of course, we know that Manson became very friendly with Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys, which created that connection.
Manson wanted to be in the music business desperately. And in the 60s, these people in the music business, you know, their homes were sort of open doors. The house on Cielo Drive, for instance, where the Tate murders happened, before Sharon and Roman moved into that house, a band by the name of Terry Melcher lived there, who was a record producer. Now, he lived there when he first moved in with a man named Mark Lindsay. Mark Lindsay was the lead of Paul Revere and the Raiders, you know, the musician. I spoke to Mark Lindsay one day. You know, I asked him about Manson, because Manson was always around. First time I met him, he was sitting on the floor in my kitchen. So Manson knew Cielo Drive well. He'd been there. He came face to face with Sharon Tate, too. A lot of people don't know that. 5 months before the murders, you know, Sharon and Manson looked into each other's eyes. You know, Mama Cass's house. Mama Cass's house was Party Central in Laurel Canyon. Nobody was monitoring who was going in and out of these houses. So Manson was floating around with you know, rubbing shoulders with Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda, and, you know, it was all cool. It was all groovy back then.
Despite having wasted years of his life in various jails and institutions for a litany of crimes, Charles Manson had found himself amongst Hollywood's elite. In his own mind, he was also within touching distance of personal stardom. Manson's magnetism, which had drawn numerous female followers, would also bring Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson into the circle of acquaintances. Wilson and Manson shared an interest in music, and they shared ideas and recorded demos together.
Or when Dennis Wilson picked up a couple of the girls hitchhiking on Pacific Coast Highway, took them home with them, and had sex with them. He left them alone in his house for several hours, and when he got back, Manson was in his house, along with a lot of other people. And Manson introduced himself to Dennis by walking up to him and dropping to his knees and kissing Dennis's feet.
Dennis was a real free spirit, made friends easily, loved to just live the free and easy life. I think at first, from what I've been told, was okay with that. He didn't mind having it just be a big party, because all the women there had been instructed to be with Dennis in any way he wanted them to be with him. And so they did, and his party-loving side loved it.
Manson saw that as his opportunity, so he made sure that Dennis Wilson had all the girls and all the drugs he could possibly want. In the meantime, whenever there was a moment, he'd sing for him. And after a while, Dennis was so inebriated, he'd say,
you know, just kind of this little cool hippie beatnik sort of character. And so he introduced him then to Terry Melcher, who was a young, well-known, well-respected music producer. He was a staff producer for Columbia Records.
Whatever Dennis Wilson really thought of Charles Manson, he convinced the other members of the Beach Boys to record a song written by the soon-to-be killer.
Manson called it Cease to Exist. They changed the lyrics to Never Learn Not to Love, which is that nonsense speak that Manson always used. He always say, you know, no sense makes sense. Always is all is forever. Never learn not to love.
Never learn not to love you.
And Manson thought, this is great. This is going to be, you know, the start of something big. But they changed his lyrics, and Manson did not like that. And he threatened to kill Dennis Wilson because of it. So it all sort of fell apart at that point.
Terry Melcher, who had lived in the Cielo Drive address where Sharon Tate and her friends would later be murdered, agreed to work with Manson on a recording.
You know, play me what you got, that kind of thing. So Melcher's in the booth, Manson's out in the tracking room. And then Melcher, being courteous, just said, okay, well, thanks very much, and we'll be in. He didn't want any part of him. He just got a bad vibe from him. I think Melcher just kind of let it slide, and then, you know, there's Manson then asking Dennis Wilson, like, what's up with Melcher? Why am I not hearing back? He wanted to get a record deal. Dennis Wilson was still trying to placate Manson, but their relationship had soured by then.
As Manson's madness intensified, Wilson, attempting to win him over, booked a time for him to record at Sound City in LA. The performance was hardly inspiring, and when Manson had left, Wilson decided not to pay the bill. Without payment, the material, which was recorded on tape, would not be released by the studio.
So Manson goes in and he goes, I want my fucking tapes. And so he fires off a round right by everybody into the filing cabinet there at Sound City to show he means business. And they're all freaked out because they're just thinking, this is what we signed up for. People don't come in here shooting guns. And so they quickly gave Manson his tape or tapes, and then he was gone. And that was the end of that. Of course, they never came out on a record or anything like that, but he got his stuff. And it wasn't very many months later that the infamous Manson murders took place.
During the mid to late 1960s, music producer Terry Melcher and Mark Lindsay, the lead singer of the band Paul Revere and the Raiders, lived together in a rented property at 10050 Cielo Drive. In a large living room with a vaulted ceiling stood a grand piano that was the center of their musical creativity.
One of the Raiders' biggest hits was called Good Thing, and it came out late 66, early 67. Anyway, that song was a top 5 hit for the Raiders, and Melcher and Lindsay wrote that in the living room together there. That's exactly at the point where Sharon Tate's body was found, I believe, hanging there from the Manson murders. And so I can never hear that song on the radio now, which I love the song, but I always think about that poor woman. And right in the same spot, the most creative thing occurred and the most evil thing occurred exactly in the same spot in a room.
The Manson family trial for murder and conspiracy to murder 7 people drew intense media scrutiny. Charles Manson's role as the architect of the murders, his bizarre courtroom behavior and appearance, which included etching a swastika symbol into his forehead, and the innocent-looking followers, whose criminal actions were in shocking contrast to their appearance, finally brought Manson the attention he had craved. Manson, the monster, was elevated to cult status, even appearing on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, which posed the question, is this the most dangerous man in America? While his victims seem to have been swallowed in the process, even Sharon Tate, an actress and wife of a Hollywood director, appeared to have had her history removed aside from the tragic final act. It was left to her mother Doris and sister Deborah to ensure she was remembered for more than simply being a victim of Manson's hate-filled and twisted desires. After Sharon's death, Doris Tate campaigned vigorously for the rights of victims of violent crime.
I don't think anyone should underestimate the power of Manson's inherent anger back then. That fueled him in great degree. We look at him or others perhaps as quote-unquote normal person would look at him and look to see what his motivations were. But he was not a normal person. We'll never know what was truly in his mind.
I believe that Charles Manson was a sociopath. A sociopath is an individual who, for the most part, has no regard for other human beings and sees them as objects of his manipulation and for his own purposes and use. But a sociopath is also able to bond with certain individuals under certain circumstances, and I believe that Charles Manson did possess that ability to empathize under certain circumstances, which made him perhaps even more dangerous because he was able to form these relationships with individuals and use them almost like his puppets. But he was relentless, he was manipulative, he was charming, he was narcissistic, and he had the ability to motivate others, which made him extremely dangerous.
I think he was an astute observer of people and could determine their vulnerabilities and would exploit those to his best advantage.
And to anybody else on the outside, he seemed like he was this messiah, or a mystic. Because he would snap his fingers and these girls would scramble around and they'd sing with him, and it appeared like he had these powers. And Manson knew how he looked. Manson knew how he was perceived, and Manson knew how to get things done. So there wasn't anything about him that wasn't contrived.
Although those who came into contact with Manson identified him as either magnetic and charming or unstable and unpredictable, no one could have anticipated just how far his deranged mind would take him. The murder of 7 people in such brutal fashion, which had seemed beyond Manson's capabilities, became a frightening reality. In his crazy ramblings that would almost define Manson in the public conscience, he spoke of hoping to instigate a race war through the murders, which he hoped would strike fear into the heart of middle-class America. But behind the complexities of his convoluted political argument, there may have been a more obvious motivation, especially given the home the Manson family had targeted.
It's so ironic and, of course, at the same time tragic that the Tate murders really occurred because of the unfortunate fact of the house that they were in.
The reason that home was targeted, out of all the homes that could have been picked in the LA area, it wasn't an accident that it was chosen, because that had been, prior to that, Melcher and Lindsay's house, but they had moved out a few months before. Now here's where the two schools of thought diverge. Some people are convinced that Manson felt that Melcher still lived there and wanted to attack him and kill him and pay him back for not giving him a record deal. There are others, I think Vincent Bugliosi is one, the prosecutor who wrote Helter Skelter. Mark Lindsay also, who had lived there. I think their feeling, Mark has told me this, his feeling is that Manson knew that Melcher had moved out. He knew the home, and it was a convenient target because he knew how to get there. He could tell his followers how you get there. Also, he figured whoever was there, whatever they did to them, would be a message that would be sent to Melcher saying, basically, in parentheses, see what happened to these people? You better give me a record deal or you could be next. Because believe me, it scared the heck out of Terry Melcher. And Mark Lindsay. Mark got a knock on his door, and it was the police, and they said, we have reason to believe your life is in danger. So they had quickly pieced together some facts there.
The fact that he had resentment and anger toward the music industry, specifically Dennis Wilson and Terry Melcher for not launching his career, I think was clearly a motivation for the murder that first night. It was his inspiration, and he was going to launch Helter Skelter anyway, so why not start there? Why not start with the object of his resentment and who he believed had blocked him from having his music career?
Although DePena was motivated to write a song about Manson's deeds, music is not immune to criticism from those who question songs that focus on extreme violence, sometimes even blaming music for instigating crime.
But I still think it's on the person that caused the crime. I don't think it should be on the songwriters. That's been something that's been disputed for many years about, like Judas Priest writing songs and kids, committing suicide. It's not Judas Priest's fault, that's going to be something that's still going to be debated to the end of time. Even if you look at AC/DC and Night Prowler, songs like that, these songs people sometimes take and make their own. Or even if you go back to Helter Skelter, that song, it's become like synonymous with crime.
The big album in 1968 was the White Album by the Beatles. Though the real title is just The Beatles, but it was all white, so everybody called it the White Album. He took George Harrison's song Piggies from the White Album and extracted some lyrics from that. And then, of course, the most famous one, Helter Skelter, which was just a McCartney song it was just a rocker. The song had no meaning whatsoever from McCartney. It's certainly not the kind that Manson extracted from it. But he used that. He wanted to call the race war, Helter Skelter. This is what was going to happen.
If I think Manson played the best trick in the world on society in that he hitched his wagon to the biggest band on planet Earth. So when he started giving all these early prison interviews and saying that, the song Helter Skelter had influenced him, and when George wrote the song Piggies, which was largely about George and Eric Clapton enjoying bacon sandwiches at the time, he thought it meant that he was talking about the establishment and they were all pigs and this, that and the other. And I think what Manson did with the White Album was a very, very clever marketing exercise, because he almost wrote himself into the White Album.
So those songs were what he used as his vehicle. I mean, the Beatles were horrified. They didn't want any part of that. I mean, John Lennon was all about, all we're saying is give peace a chance. And, he didn't want any part of Manson.
After failing to achieve greatness through song and tune, Charles Manson had achieved his aim through the most vile and abhorrent act. Ironically, his name and his deeds have since been incorporated into the music world he had so desperately sought to join. While some artists think only of entertainment when they construct the lyrics to a song, others have a heightened sense of responsibility when the subject matter is tragic and real.
You kind of feel a little bit of a responsibility to at least get the story down to where it makes sense, and as you're writing, you want to also think about what the listener is going to be feeling, So it's more intense than it seems, but you do have the strong sense that you've got to get it right, and make sure that people know exactly what you're talking about. We try not to candy coat anything. We just write down from the heart, and hopefully the listener will love it. But yeah, you feel responsibility for sure.
Regardless of the accuracy of a piece of work, a song, a movie, or even a painting, certain artists push the boundaries more than most. Some songs, particularly those that draw on the darker side of human nature, face inevitable backlash, including the prospect of government intervention.
I don't think being censored does anybody any good. I think it's horrible for any kind of artist, people that do film, music, anything where you have the freedom to write down what you want to write down is a beautiful thing.
Just create what they create, and they are not trying to ascribe a meaning to it. They put it out into the world, and each listener should make their own judgment as to what the song means to them.
Manson's failure to achieve greatness in the music industry did not deter his pursuit of the artistic form. After his sentencing for orchestrating the murder of his music,
with our fans, they know that I'm about bringing people together. What you got to realize is there are people that actually do pay attention to what we write and what we say and how we conduct ourselves as human beings, We really believe in treating people with respect. That's what our music's always been about.
Through murder and mayhem, Charles Manson achieved celebrity status and continued to be a figure in popular culture for decades after the last of his crime. He was a cult figure whose courtroom appearances projected him into the living rooms of 1970s America via a hungry news media. As the Manson story unfolded, he became even more fascinating to a greater number of people. This manipulative man, whose deranged view of the world may have been disgusting to most people, was worshipped by fans who continued to believe his absurd ramblings. In the same way that fans might adore the lead singer of a popular band or follow every action of a movie star, Manson was lauded, elevated, and glorified by his followers.
Many diabolical, infamous individuals like Charles Manson, like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker is another example, Ted Bundy, developed followings, and oftentimes they're female followings, which are sometimes referred to as murder groupies. These are oftentimes individuals who feel that somehow they have developed a bond, a connection with this individual. It's also a way, I think, to get close to celebrity, I think there's that aspect of it. Someone who is, in their own way, a celebrity, as Charles Manson was, a morbid sort of rock star. And there's also the danger. People like to get close to danger, and these individuals represent that. It's an opportunity to get close to evil.
He's like the Super Bowl of serial killers, if you think about it, especially because the court cases, they made the court cases huge. All that stuff was very watched.
I think that the appeal of these individuals to the general public, it's multifaceted, but it has something to do with the fact that these individuals are so over the top and behave in such ways that are incomprehensible, and yet we feel compelled to try to understand.
After the two-night rampage in 1969, the Manson family retreated to their desert hideaway. At first, police struggled to find an obvious suspect, and the Los Angeles elite were gripped by fear. A week later, in an unrelated raid on Spawn Ranch as police investigated the theft of motor vehicles, members of the Manson family were arrested, but were later released on a technicality. In October, there were further arrests relating to theft and damage of property in Death Valley, although the Manson family had still not been linked to the Tate and LaBianca murders. But when Susan Atkins hinted to fellow cellmates that she had been involved in the Hollywood Hills massacres, a leak had been sprung, and police were quick to pounce. Manson would go down in history as a brutal killer for his manipulation of the minds of the young people to kill and kill again. He was a puppet master who pulled the strings on savagery. And in his capture and through the highly publicized court case, he became known to more than simply those lives he had directly impacted.
We immortalize all sorts of things in music. You know, we immortalize and romanticize and glorify war. We glorify the Great Depression in the United States. Things that were really, really bad become romanticized and glorified. Music is an art form, similar to painting, movies, sculpture, any of these things that can be used as a way to remember. To me, it's not surprising at all that the likes of Charles Manson would become immortalized in music.
While some sections of society might criticize musicians who have focused on crimes of such an appalling nature, Kate and DePenna believes in the positive power of shining a light into humankind's darkest corners.
I guarantee you there are kids that do read these lyrics and go, I didn't know about that. So we're educating, even though some people might think there's a fine line on how we're educating, but we are educating. The human mind is a mystery still to this day. We're talking about things that still aren't figured out yet. Like, they're still trying to find out why some of these guys have done what they've done. So these stories are very important.
Well, when Manson died, people were expecting, dark thunderclouds and, and hell, the gates of hell opening up. And it was just this little old man that died. He just sort of withered away.
Manson's evil face, the swastika scar, and the crimes he inspired continue to linger in popular culture. He has been immortalized by artists who have recorded his history and preserved his diabolical legacy.
It's a different time now, so when he died, he wasn't like, if it would have been 80s or 90s, he would have been totally glorified, but we live in a world now that's politically correct, and it's not the same as it was in the 70s and 80s. So he didn't get the send-off that he probably thought he was gonna get. Which, for the families, that's probably a great thing.
In January 1971, Charles Manson was found guilty of 7 counts of murder and conspiracy to murder for his role in the killing of them Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, and Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. Initially facing death, Manson had his sentence commuted to life following changes to California law. In November 2017, Charles Manson's own life was finally snuffed out at age 83. He had lived most of his life in prison and died in a hospital in Kern County, California.